So, have you ever thought about whether history could be, well, more like a science? What if we could actually diagnose the past or calculate it with the kind of certainty you get from math? It sounds a little out there, but in the middle of the 20th century, that's exactly what a lot of historians were trying to do. But one really brilliant thinker, Jacques Barzun, he came along and offered a powerful second opinion. And honestly, it's a take that's become more relevant today than ever before.
Okay, so this whole thing really kicked into high gear back in 1958. This quote here, it was a major call to arms from a really influential historian, William Langer. He was basically telling his peers, hey, you need to start using modern psychology, arguing that they just didn't have the speculative audacity that scientists did. And the message? It was crystal clear. Traditional history was falling behind, and it needed a whole new prescription.
And look, this wasn't just some friendly suggestion either. There was a real feeling going around that the entire field of history was, well, ailing. Critics were calling it superficial, intellectually conservative, just unable to speak to the modern world. It needed a cure, and it needed one fast.
So we're going to stick with that medical metaphor for a bit. First, we'll look at the sick patient, history itself. Then we'll meet the new doctors who showed up promising a cure. After that, we'll dive into Jacques Barzun's incredibly sharp critique of their methods, and finally, we'll explore Barzun's passionate defense of what he called the historian's true craft. So, the diagnosis was pretty grim. History was seen as this field that was just buried in conservatism, totally lacking that speculative audacity needed to give us real insights into the world's problems. The perception was, pretty simply, that the discipline was in decline.
So into this crisis step two, new specialists, psychohistory and quanto-history. And both of them came with this huge promise to transform the study of the past from just, telling stories into a real objective science. Okay, so our first specialist is psychohistory. And its goal was, well, it was ambitious. It wanted to get inside the minds of people from the past. The idea was to fuse history with psychoanalysis, to uncover all the hidden fears, the secret drives, the unconscious motives that really made things happen. And specialist number two, quanto-history. This whole approach promised to bring the clean, cold rigor of mathematics to the absolute messiness of the past. Its supporters believed that if you could just count things and measure things, you could find objective, data-driven truths that old-fashioned storytelling could never, ever reveal.
But as you can imagine, not everyone was sold on these new cures, and this is where the historian and critic Jacques Barzun comes in. He basically played devil's advocate, offering this incredibly powerful second opinion that questioned the very foundations of these new scientific histories.
Barzun was really methodical about this. He broke down his critique into three fundamental questions. First, what is history even about anymore? Second, are the procedures we're using really methodical? And third, and this is the big one, what actually counts as proof? All right, let's start with substance. Barzun's first point was that these new methods completely change what history is. You see, traditionally, history is a story about res gestae. That's a Latin term that just means things done. It's about actions and events. But these new approaches, they turned that story into a clinical diagnosis, swapping out the narrative of human action for an analysis of subconscious stuff. And this slide shows that shift just perfectly. Caesar's famous line, I came, I saw, I conquered, that's a pure historical statement. It's just reporting what happened, the things that were done. But saying the mainspring of his character was conquest, that's a psychological diagnosis of his inner self. See how the focus moves from the external event to some invisible internal mechanism? Next up, Barzun went after the method. Now that word sounds so rigorous, right? But what he argued was that in practice, psychohistorians were just picking and choosing ideas from all these different, often conflicting schools of thought. A little bit of Freud here, a dash of Jung there. It wasn't a consistent method at all. It was more like an eclectic grab bag of terms. And this brings us to what is maybe Barzun's most powerful critique, and it all comes down to evidence. Here's the crucial difference. Historical evidence, like a letter, a law, an artifact, it's public. We can all look at it, we can debate it. But a psychological inference? That's private. It's a claim about what's happening inside someone's head, which, let's be honest, we can never truly verify. So, to make this point really clear, Barzun uses this classic example from the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau's autobiography. Rousseau writes about this encounter with a beautiful woman he really desired, but then, all of a sudden, he was completely put off by her. So the question is, why?
Well, Rousseau's own account is based on an observable fact, what he says he saw. But the psychohistorian's diagnosis just throws that out. It claims that Rousseau unconsciously projected his own anxieties about his body onto the woman. And this is Barzun's point exactly. The psychohistorian is claiming to know Rousseau's mind better than Rousseau himself, turning a verifiable account into a totally unverifiable inference. Okay, so what about quanto-history? I mean, surely numbers are objective. They can't lie, can they? Well, Barzun argues that this illusion of objectivity is precisely the problem. The assumption that just because something is a number, it's automatically true, that can be a really dangerous one. Just take this example. The amazing historian Fernand Braudel, he spent pages and pages doing these incredibly complex calculations on worker incomes. And his big conclusion? They lived on the edge of starvation. But, as Barzun points out, traditional sources, simple descriptions of daily life and hardship, had already told us the exact same thing. All that complicated math didn't actually reveal a new truth. It just put a scientific-looking gloss on something we already knew. And this really gets to the heart of the critique. Another historian, J.H. Plum, pointed out that we live in a numerous society. We just have this gut instinct to believe in the truth of numbers. We have a quicker acceptance of them, even when the data is shaky or the calculations are, as he says, almost meaningless. Numbers, Barzun was arguing, aren't just data. They're a really powerful form of rhetoric. So if Barzun was so critical of these new sciences, what was his alternative? He wasn't saying we should go back to the past or stop innovating. Instead, he made this incredibly powerful case for the unique and frankly irreplaceable craft of the historian. For Barzun, the historian's craft relies on its own set of virtues. It tells a compelling story of things done, a story that's grounded in public evidence that anyone can go and examine. It speaks in plain language, not confusing jargon. And most importantly, it uses human judgment and common sense to navigate complexity, embracing the messy particularity of events rather than trying to force them into some neat and tidy scientific formula. And this leaves us with a question that's probably even more urgent now than it was back in Barzun's time. I mean, we are surrounded by big data, by analytics, by pop psychology explanations for absolutely everything. So what is the value of a story? What do we actually lose if our past stops being a story and just becomes a data set to be mined or a psyche to be diagnosed? What happens when we forget that history, at its very core, is the grand, complex, and deeply human story of res gestae, the things we have done?